I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lectures. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear Professor Brandie Siegfried of the Department of English deliver today's House of Learning lecture entitled, From Artisan to Icon, The Amazing Evolution of Shakespeare. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. This semester, in addition to Professor Siegfried's lecture, next we will be pleased to hear Professor Randy Lewis from the Department of Chemistry give a lecture entitled Biofuels in the 21st Century on Thursday, January 31st. On Thursday, February 14th, Professor Terry Olson from the Department of Marriage, Family, and Human Development will deliver a Valentine's Day lecture on relationships and personal authenticity entitled Redeeming the Past, the Power of the Present Moment. On Thursday, February 28th, Professor Gordon Lim from the Department of Social Work will give an address entitled A Bright Future, Strengthening American Indian Fragile Families. On Thursday, March 13th, Department of Political Science Professor Matt Holland will deliver a lecture entitled How to Think About the First Great American, Hawthorne's Suggestion. Our last House of Learning lecture for this semester will feature Mr. Gordon Daines, University Archivist and Special Collections Curator in the Harold B. Lee Library, whose lecture is called Training Teachers and Learning to Lead, Brigham Young University, the Church College of Hawaii, and the Role of Higher Education in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lectures series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's lecturer. Professor Brandie Siegfried earned a baccalaureate and master's degrees in English at BYU, an MA in Women's Studies at Brandeis University, and a PhD in English from Brandeis in 1993. At BYU, she teaches a range of classes on Shakespeare and Renaissance literature, including an honors class in Shakespeare and film, graduate classes in contemporary adaptations of Shakespeare, and courses on feminism and literature. In recognition of her outstanding scholarship, Professor Siegfried has received a 3-year Alcuin Fellowship, one of BYU's highest professorial honors. The author of several articles and book chapters, Professor Siegfried has presented papers at conferences in Canada, England, Spain, and Ireland, as well as all across America. For several years, she has guided master's students through the complex and trying process of writing a thesis and is a model of a faithful academic mentor to her students. It gives great pleasure to welcome today Professor Brandie Siegfried.
Thank you. From artisan to icon, the amazing evolution of Shakespeare. My story begins not in London, not in Stratford, not in England at all. Rather, I begin this account where I plan to end, in the American West, in the early part of the 20th century. In March of 1920, comfortably ensconced at the Hotel Utah in Salt Lake City, W.B. Yeats, renowned Irish poet, essayist, playwright, statesman, and soon-to-be Nobel Prize winner, penned a short letter to Olivia Shakespeare. "You see, we are in the Mormon city," he writes, "and on Sunday the streets are very quiet." He goes on to explain that, quote, "The Mormons are great keepers of the Sunday, which, however, they combined with a great passion for the theater and music. Music and speech and theater are taught as religious duties," end quote. Yeats sees at close hand what Lawrence Levine has more recently observed with the added perspective of historical hindsight, that with respect to late 19th and early 20th century American audiences, quote, "The same Americans who found diversion and pleasure in lengthy political debates, who sought joy and God in the sermons of church and camp meeting, all thrilled to Shakespeare's eloquence, memorized his soliloquies, delighted in his dialogues." Yet Levine and other scholars also suggest that this is the peculiar moment in time when Shakespeare's popularity with mass audiences would begin its sharp decline. And this downward trend occurred precisely at the same moment that Shakespeare's status as a marker of high culture made a startling, even meteoric rise. By the middle of the 20th century, Shakespeare was no longer the playwright of the people, these scholars argue, but a full-blown aesthetic icon. The plays came to be seen as having almost scriptural authority, and by their very nature they were too sacred and sophisticated for a mass audience, and therefore in need of careful redaction by priestly scholars and the arbiters of artistic sensibility. I want to suggest, however, that this tale of the cultural evolution of Shakespeare's plays from lowbrow to highbrow is a little more complicated than traditional literary history might suggest. In the examples I will shortly develop, I want you to notice two things about the history of Shakespeare's popularity. First, from the printing of the first folio to the first film production, there is a steadily intensifying tension between two competing myths. On the one hand, we have the myth of singular genius, a myth driven by assumptions about intellectual and artistic development that can be summarized as, quote, "Either you have the gift or you don't." On the other hand, we have a tale of the power of will, both individual and collective, that is to say, the dream of the possibility of attainment. Second, I want you to notice that the tension between the myths of singular genius on the one hand and the power of purposeful betterment and achievement on the other is paralleled by another persistent tension, that is, the question of whether the value of Shakespeare, the power of Shakespeare, is to be found in the words or in the scene. Is the force of Shakespeare's popularity, whether highbrow or lowbrow, weighted more heavily towards language and the experience of how what we hear shapes what we imagine? Or is the essence of Shakespeare to be found tipping more weightily toward ideas literally embodied and the experience of how what we see shapes what we understand? Notice that it was never a question of either hearing or seeing, but rather which is more decidedly the essential quality that would then shape our experience of the other. With these points in mind, we turn to history. Our scene, London, early in Shakespeare's career, when he and others had more or less succeeded in convincing the public that a playwright shared the same respectable social position as a shipwright, a wheelwright, a carpenter, or a tailor. This was a significant rise in the status from the previous category in which players and actors had been slotted, seen, that is, as more or less synonymous with pickpockets or jugglers, tricksters, and prostitutes. Although Shakespeare would steadily improve his social and economic circumstances over his lifetime, so much so that eventually he would be able to purchase the title of gentleman, he was very much a member of the artisan class initially, a man who made his way by doing things with his hands. He and others were often referred to as scribblers and players, and they took advantage of the fact that their work was sometimes confused with the more respectable scribal trade. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Middleton, and others formed what we might think of as the beginnings of the entertainment industry. They turned the experience of public performance into a regular part of everyday life, and their published plays were meant to be read for pleasure first, for betterment second. Moreover, while the theatrical production of the plays was the major form of revenue for the playhouses, it wasn't long before publication was seen as another economic venue. Prefaces to plays by several writers of the period stress that, with the printed script in hand, that's what you bought, the reader was free to perform the play on the stage of the mind, and that became a popular metaphor in the period, the stage of the mind. And readers were encouraged to compete with actual performances. In short, the playwrights themselves intentionally encouraged the perception that the printed word was in overt competition with the professional visual production. And while someone like Marlowe might be touted as a singular genius, the potential buyer of a book was encouraged to consider the personal possibilities for betterment inherent in reading dramatic renditions of Caesar's, Mark Antony's, or Henry V's great speeches. With respect to Shakespeare's evolution from artisan to icon, the first 100 years after Shakespeare's death are characterized by three major events: the publication of the first folio in 1623, the closing of the theater shortly after the execution of Charles I, and which continued throughout the interregnum, and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Let's see, here's where I get to use an image. There we go. The publication of the first folio granted a new and special status to Shakespeare's plays. They were now expensive, a collectible item in a vellum package meant to appeal to the elite and discriminating audience, and not to mention to appeal to wealthy individuals who could shell out quite a bit. Ben Jonson helped fuel the flames of Shakespeare's reputation as a literary genius, while at the same time putting him up front in an interesting double bind, a double bind that emphasized his status as both someone who could work hard with his hands, but also someone who might in fact have the fire and flame of genius. It's in the prefatory material to the first folio that Ben Jonson declares that although Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek, he deserved to be ranked with the classical authors, and as such could be understood to be not for an age but for all time. Those are the most famous and most frequently quoted praises of Shakespeare. Only 20 years after the publication of the first folio, at the beginning of the English Civil War, a parliamentary edict forbade the performance of plays, claiming that, quote, public sports do not well agree with public calamities. And it condemned, quote, public stage plays as no more than, quote, spectacles of pleasure too commonly expressing lascivious mirth and levity. Shakespeare was singled out as one of these lascivious writers. By 1647, the ban on performances was made officially permanent, and in January of 1649, King Charles I was publicly beheaded. The drama of the popular stage and the theatricality of the king's death on the executioner's platform were explicitly linked in publications of the day. A contemporary defense of the execution claimed it would never have been necessary, quote, had Charles but studied Scripture half so much as he studied Ben Jonson or Shakespeare, end quote. Languishing in prison, Charles had indeed been perusing the plays in the weeks before his death. John Milton, impatient with those claiming that Charles had been a pious man, used an example from Shakespeare to quell the argument. Here's his quote. He gives an example of, quote, one whom we well know was the closet companion of King Charles' solitude, Mr. William Shakespeare. Milton turns Shakespeare's words against Charles, quoting from Richard III and insisting that, quote, pious words all too often are delivered by the mouth of a tyrant, end quote. Still, the interregnum had to come to an end, and with the restoration of the monarchy came the restoration of the theater. I should note, by the way, that there was a period of about 20 years after the first folio was published where, other than one more folio edition, nothing much of Shakespeare's was published. In fact, he seems to have been forgotten. It's interesting to note that because in a period where the theaters were closed down, many other plays were very popular at bookstores. So booksellers were doing a hefty, thriving trade in the plays, say, of Jonson or Beaumont and Fletcher and others. Shakespeare wasn't up there yet. So he clearly wasn't seen as someone who had to be published, even in those dark days of no theater. I turn for a moment in those 1660s to the fact that the response to Shakespeare with the return of the monarchy isn't what you might think. One of Shakespeare's earliest critics, Margaret Cavendish, says some interesting things, and she's uncharacteristically positive about her reading of Shakespeare. She, by the way, had had access to an extensive private library, and so had been able to read several of the plays much earlier than those published in post-1660. Here's what she says. She says, "So well he hath expressed in his plays all sorts of persons, one would think he had been transformed into every one of those persons he hath described. For her, Shakespeare's various and detailed characters, all springing from the same authorial imagination, made up a microcosmic mirror, a mirror for the macrocosmic world around her." Cavendish herself, though appreciative of Shakespeare's skill in social portraiture, is still far from idolizing the playwright. In letter 162 of Sociable Letters, she reminisces about a youthful fantasy of being in love with Shakespeare, but quickly goes on to dismiss him in favor of her husband, who, quote, "is far beyond Shakespeare for comical humor, as Shakespeare beyond an ordinary poet," end quote. Shakespeare does well, in her opinion, because he meets with the criteria by which she judges men generally. In short, Cavendish handles the barge before the true apotheosis of Shakespeare occurs, and the element of veneration is largely absent in her ruminations. As Frank Kermode puts it, quote, "the Duchess prefers her husband." But reading aside, production of the plays on the Restoration stage was limited. Cavendish's regard for Shakespeare's comedies and romances is quite distinct from the tragical tastes of her literary peers. Indeed, few of Shakespeare's romantic comedies were even performed between 1640 and 1700. And when a comedy was performed, adapters went to great lengths to whittle away at the independence, good judgment, and biting humor of famous female characters in Shakespeare's plays, characters such as Viola, Portia, and Beatrice. Several scholars have documented the close relationship between attitudes towards what constituted appropriate female behavior in conduct books of the time and the widespread introduction of the pathos play, which depended on the sufferings of women for its dramatic impact. In fact, the perception of women prevalent throughout the later 17th and early 18th centuries corresponds to alterations made to Shakespeare's plays, as in keeping with the nature of the pathetic play, adapters added scenes featuring helpless female virtue, ennobled by love and fraught by fear. Because the comedies were not nearly as conducive to such adaptations, the tragedies and histories were frequently staged. Indeed, regardless of genre, adaptation of Shakespeare's plays was deemed absolutely necessary. Referring to Shakespeare, John Dryden writes, quote, "Let us applaud his scenes of love, but let us confess that he understood not either greatness or perfect honor in the parts of any of his women." Not surprisingly, Dryden proffers Ben Jonson as a better example of dramatic competence and ethical perspicuity. In fact, many of the later dramatists preferred Jonson's ability to meld humor with what they understood to be moral clarity, and the perfect honor of female characters became the measure by which the rightness of a theatrical piece might be judged. Hence, the fact that Dryden, as well as 5 other popular playwrights, all attempt to erase the uncomely lowness, I'm quoting there, of Shakespeare's female characters by giving them special new attributes: emotive, soft, yielding, fearful, and virtuous, meant to make them more acceptable to a contemporary audience. Indeed, the character Beatrice, borrowed from Much Ado About Nothing, only makes an appearance in Davenant's adaptation of Measure for Measure, another of Shakespeare's plays, where she and Benedict are added in order to wrest a romantic theme from what is otherwise a play that treats of love and desire in the most problematic of terms. In Gilden's adaptation of The Merchant of Venice, Portia's propensity for disguise, as well as her intellectual prowess and social perspicacity, are explained as elements of circumstance, repugnant for a woman of admirable sensibility, but equally necessary in circumstances where love might require such extreme sacrifice. In a 1663 adaptation of The Taming of the Shrew, the minor character Grumio becomes a major character around whom the entire plot revolved. In this adaptation, Grumio becomes a saucy Scotsman, and the play is hence appropriately retitled The Sunny Scot. The original Italian setting is shifted to London, and almost half of Shakespeare's plot and dialogue are cut out. Now here's where I'm going to pause for a moment and make a quick comment about something else that's going on at the same time. Because a new mode of enjoying Shakespeare has gradually grown up with the reintroduction of theatrical performance, and that is something called the gallery stroll. And these happen both in public galleries, a growing number of public galleries, as well as private galleries of individuals who own wealthy homes. And what happened would be famous painters like Hogarth would paint a scene that had actually been performed on the stage, and they would pay a particular actor, in this case Garrick, playing King Lear, to come and model for them so that they could recreate the scene that audiences had seen in the theater. And then later, people could stroll back through these galleries and look at the scenes from actual performances. And interestingly, the gallery stroll began to compete with theatrical performances for audiences. Indeed, it began to be thought that the less educated could be inspired by paintings and later illustrations, which clarified thematic development and ethical inquiry. Interestingly, the revival of Shakespeare's plays shortly after the restoration of the monarchy also meant the revival of titillating theatrical conventions such as cross-dressing. However, whereas in Shakespeare's plays the novelty of cross-dressing was derived from plot and casting combinations, which meant that the comedies frequently featured boy actors playing female characters who disguised themselves as boys, the theater of the later 17th century sometimes featured women playing female characters who disguised themselves as boys. As several scholars have noted, the novelty of seeing women on the public stage, and revealingly breeched to boot, excited much interest and popular speculation. Cavendish was quick to pounce on the possibilities of the convention, musing on what she had seen and what it might mean. In one of her social letters, she describes, quote, two handsome women actors, both sisters, one of whom was the best female actor that ever I saw. And for acting a man's part, she did it so naturally as if she had been of that sex. And yet she was of a neat, slender shape. But being in her doublet and breeches and a sword hanging by her side, one would have believed she had never worn a petticoat and had been more used to handle a sword than a distaff. And when she danced in a masculine habit, she would caper higher and oftener than any of the men. And when she danced after the fashion of her own sex, she danced justly, evenly, smoothly, and gracefully. Cavendish was fascinated by the liquid-like adaptability of the female actor, who, regardless of sex, could successfully perform the masculine or feminine parts with equal success. By the early 1700s, the expansion of the book trade meant that despite being considered unfit in their entirety for stage production, Shakespeare's plays could continue to be read in printed form. These editions were touted as worth owning not so much because Shakespeare was a singular genius, but because he was one among many great writers of an inspired era, a period which had nostalgically come to be known as the Golden Age of Elizabethan England. Inexpensive penny pamphlets were still being produced with excerpts of famous bits from favorite plays, and it was not uncommon for Shakespeare to make an appearance in the drawing room as part of an evening's entertainment. But as political turmoil in France in the late 1700s gave way to the French Revolution and Napoleon's aggressive empire building, Shakespeare's cultural status took an unexpected turn. Voltaire's famous critique of Shakespeare's plays on classical grounds was seen as yet another act of aggression by the French, and Shakespeare became the political mascot for national identity, the figurehead for a kind of English national religion. Meanwhile, the German Romantics, who more or less defined themselves in opposition to the classical tradition, were soon joined by English Romantics, and what had always up to that point been readily acknowledged as flawed aspects of the plays was suddenly lauded as the hallmarks of inspired genius. Shakespeare's inattention to the classical tradition was not evidence of small Latin and less Greek, as Shakespeare's contemporaries liked to tease him, and which Restoration dramatists high-handedly lamented. No, these were markers of an inspired mind, a mind sensible to the world around it. Still, actually, let me pause for a moment. This particular take on Shakespeare would last well into the 19th century, and I do have one more visual so you're kind of thinking ahead. We're going to straddle two periods here just for a moment. This is J.M.W. Turner's painting done in 1836, so later than the period I'm talking about, but it kind of gives you a sense of the direction that we're going with Shakespeare and the tension between stage performance and the growing number of paintings and illustrations of Shakespeare scenes. This one I want you to see and take a close look at. If you notice in the far lower right-hand corner, there are two little figures standing on the balcony there. That's Juliet and her nurse. But clearly that's not where the eye is meant to stay. In this particular painting, Shakespeare's characters are part of a larger transcendent reality in which nature can inspire and redeem. We also see Shakespeare taking on later, and I'll show you this shortly, the hues and colors of pre-Raphaelite and eventually Impressionist painters, and this has an effect on the literary scholarship regarding Shakespeare's plays as well. In the British colonies, so let me go back for a moment, though, to underscore something I just said. To return to the late 1700s, the point for both political and literary thinkers was that thanks to the thematically ready-to-hand nature of speeches in the history plays, quips from the comedies, and truisms from the romances, Shakespeare could stand in as the national figurehead for both political and artistic freedom. In the British colonies, this had unexpected consequences. In America, for instance, the first recorded performance of a Shakespeare play occurred in 1750 when a troupe of traveling players presented Richard III, a wicked and perverse monarch. The same players performed in Williamsburg, Virginia, and returned to New York and Philadelphia over the next several years. That company was soon joined by others. Of this period, Russ MacDonald writes, quote, "As the colonists became more numerous, more prosperous, and more diverse philosophically, Shakespeare began to make his way into the culture, often as a kind of social marker. Companies made up mostly of traveling English actors began to stage a range of plays in the major urban centers, particularly Philadelphia and New York, where George Washington attended a performance of Hamlet in the spring of 1773. End quote. There was still resistance to Shakespeare's plays, however, Washington's apparent sanction notwithstanding. Boston authorities in 1792 closed a production of Hamlet on moral grounds. Remember, Hamlet does lots of puns, lots of sexual innuendo in the play. That educated people in colonial America possessed at least a minimal acquaintance with some of the major Shakespearean speeches and characters is apparent from the following parody published in 1770 in a newspaper called the Massachusetts Spy. Quote, "Be taxed or not be taxed? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in our minds to suffer the slights and cunnings of deceitful statesmen, or to petition against illegal taxes, and by opposing end them." In short, if England wanted to hoist Shakespeare as the banner of political and intellectual freedom from oppressive foreign traditions, the Americans were only too happy to follow, much to the chagrin of King George and his government. It's in the early 1800s, however, that things get really interesting. Thanks to a robust book trade and a growing emphasis on public education, printers and booksellers were eager to establish a steady market based on a diet of items considered crucial for the education of loyal citizens. This was bolstered in turn by social movements decrying the state of the poor, the general moral state of society, and the more particular situation of women. Not surprisingly, late Romantic and early Victorian concerns with women's position in society found their way to Shakespeare in a big way, and allusions to the character of Ophelia from the play Hamlet were rife in popular moralizing. In fact, in Victorian England, Ophelia was a common synecdoche for the single woman left destitute of love, financial support, and ultimately reason. The theater played a leading role in perpetuating this figure of woeful femininity, and graphical renditions of her character reflect a similar tendency. Certainly, the artists under consideration here reinforced such attitudes. The emergence of Ophelia as an icon for the plight of real women was first made popular by John Everett Millet's celebrated painting, finished around 1851. As Timothy Hilton points out, the subject was an unusual one at the time, and Arthur Hughes's depiction of Ophelia later, sorry I don't have a graphic for you, painted the same year, fueled the sudden popularity. Indeed, with more than 50 portrayals recorded in exhibition catalogs, Ophelia became the single most popular literary subject for artists in the 19th century. Situated within nature, disheveled and frail, the Victorian Ophelia iterates a forceful call to ethical responsibility. And now Shakespeare was understood to be the voice of moral enlightenment. Let me pause here because I just want to, again, jump ahead a little bit and show you another evolution. If Ophelia was going to come to be the major representational figurement of Shakespeare's play, especially tied to some of these moral issues, it's interesting that within 20 years, we're going to see not just Ophelia, but Hamlet overtaken by females and female issues, and this time by a female actor. And so we've got Sarah Bernhardt very famously playing Hamlet on stage to rave reviews, actually. And here's why. If you consider, if by the 1890s the ideal of woman as the arbiter of moral rectitude has been firmly established in society, it makes sense then for a character who represents someone struggling with ethical issues and moral questions to be portrayed as a woman. This was seen as reinforcing the reality of Hamlet's moral dilemma. Okay, so I'll go on with where I left off now. The emergence of Ophelia as an icon for the plight of real women, oh, sorry, I'll skip ahead. Indeed, with more than 50 portrayals recorded in exhibition catalogs, Ophelia became the single most popular literary subject for artists in the 19th century. The early work of Daniel Mcleese, oops, let me skip ahead. The darling of Dickens, whose painting The Play Scene in Hamlet was the sensation of an exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1842, managed a level of technical expertise that would contribute immeasurably to the blurring of the boundaries between theatrical and textual experience. As Nancy Weston points out, though Mcleese's reputation has diminished in the 20th century, quote, he was a major figure in the mid-19th century cultural world, and his works have much to tell us about the reception of Shakespeare. In Mcleese's famous work, the formulation of perspective is such that the viewer in the painting faces in the same direction as the major characters of the scene. To put it another way, we look on with Claudius's court at the players, and in this sense become part of the dramatic scene. In fact, Mcleese's painting was the cause of so much excitement, in large part because it upstaged, so to speak, the theater itself. I want to underscore something before I go on. Mcleese is deeply, deeply committed to the prospect that Shakespeare really could be the voice of moral enlightenment in the period, and that painting had more artistic and aesthetic power to commit to that voice than the stage itself did. Mcleese was the first to take full advantage of the growing reciprocity between the stage and canvas, a fluidity of medium that would eventually result in the emergence of theatrical painting and pictorial theater, two modes of dramatic expression that in many ways were mimetic twins. Indeed, from the mid-1800s to the end of the century, theater unabashedly framed itself as painting. This would come as no surprise, given that, as Michael Booth points out, the period was one in which people, quote, flocked to the exhibition of panoramas and dioramas, went to magic lantern lectures, visited the new art galleries, read illustrated magazines, bought cheap prints of popular paintings in their millions, looked through stereoscopes, end quote. Most were enthralled by the new technology of photography, and by the end of the century, film made its debut. In short, it was a pictorial culture, and the theater was also pictorial. Theater's pictorial preference was explicitly articulated just 3 years before the exhibition of Mcleese's painting, when his friend William Charles Macready, a powerful producer of Shakespearean dramas, publicly declared that the aspiration informing his desire to produce Shakespeare had always been, quote, fidelity of illustration, with the intent of transferring his picture from the poet's mind to the stage, complete in its parts and harmoniously arranged as to figure, scene, and action, end quote. Moreover, the contemporary biographer of the much-celebrated actor Charles Keene was quick to summarize the central success of this thespian's career as Keene's having made the theater, quote, a valuable school of antiquarian illustration and a living lecture on the past, end quote. Capturing a picture from the poet's mind is explicitly linked with moral education, a process the theatrical painters literally gave form to as they combined and transferred elements from both play script and performance practice to the canvas. That the pictorial spirit was part of an effort at moral and intellectual education was also a move meant to unite the technical skills of the theater with the ethical concerns of culture, and this cannot be overemphasized. And here's where I'm again going to, I'll go back. Take you to a famous illustration by Rossetti. This is from 1858. And I want you to think about this in contrast to Mcleese and another that we'll look at shortly. In this one, in contrast to inviting the viewer to become part of the drama, Here, Rossetti is clearly a little more partial to the reading process, and it's very compact. The frame is tightly woven with image after image after image, lots of symbol and detail. Just look at those closely. And the point was pretty straightforward. These visual cues were meant to replace, conceptually, the language of an entire scene. So they were reproduced frequently in volumes of Shakespeare, but then also were part of these gallery walks that continued in popularity. Okay, so I'm going to, go back to Mcleese. The pictorial spirit was part of an effort at the moral and intellectual education, and Shakespeare was at the ethics-driven center of the movement. The need for more of the bard in public entertainment was bolstered obligingly by the morally inflected declarations of Shakespeare scholars. Frederick James Furnivall, who founded the New Shakespeare Society in the early 1870s, loudly decried what he considered to be the deplorable state of the average audience member. Quote, although the average Englishman may have read a play or so, he has no notion of the characteristics, the periods, or succession of Shakespeare's works, and can tell next to nothing about the poet himself, end quote. Thus, in order to nurture the moral imagination of the play-going public, quote, Shakespeare on stage must be illustrated like a book. In a century where we understand paintings and illustrated editions of the bard to be paramount, end quote. I should point out, we are talking about some of the highbrow things here, and I'll go on to talk about those momentarily. But I want to underscore the fact that, particularly in contrast to the quote we just heard, where some of these academicians are insisting that pictorial theater and illustrations of Shakespeare books are necessary because common readers can't understand Shakespeare, there was a growing movement among the working class to push for more inexpensive volumes of Shakespeare. And laborers, in fact, were reading and memorizing large portions of the plays. Inexpensive pocket versions of Shakespeare did lend themselves to certain worries, however. They sometimes worried that reading was a form of idleness, and their betters often worried that the plays were dangerous in the hands of the rabble. And no accident that many of the major speakers in what would come to be one of the first true labor movements in England had memorized large portions of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare shows up in their speeches, in their rallying cries. With that in mind, let me go on, and we'll talk a little bit more about Mcleese's work, because with respect to the pictorial theater and theatrical painting, at the most fundamental level of public valuation, where characteristics deemed foundational to ethical experience must be transmitted through education, Shakespearean drama on stage was an expanded illustration of the burgeoning icon of moral sensibility, providing a rich interpretive context for painters like Mcleese. To return to Mcleese's work, then, we note the importance of his painting as part of the rich soil of graphic expression that would nurture further the subsequent growth of a robust pictorial theater. Hailed as the lion of the gallery, Mcleese's play scene foregrounds the sensation of physical presence in relation to the artifice involved in aesthetic pleasure. The players in the scene are framed on a little stage before the court in such a way that the court, sitting in the foreground, is seen to share the larger frame of the painting, dramatizing the play within the play as a scene within a larger court drama. Given the telescopic effect of this framing, perspective invites the viewer to recognize a further frame that encompasses a yet larger drama, the theater of art in which an audience comes to gaze and be gazed upon. So basically, we're looking at the layering effect here and the fact that you, as part of the frame, become part of the viewing audience in the play, watching the play scene in Hamlet. So lots of telescoping going on. I want to jump quickly, in the interest of time, to the figure of Ophelia here, because she provides a critical central present that mediates between the individual viewer's experience of acting within the theatrical moment. You are part of the audience that's been painted here, but you're the moving part. And the general culture's experience of the many Ophelias whose presence exerts a compelling call to moral obligation. We sense the power of that call in the response of Dickens, who referred to the painting as, quote, a tremendous production, and then went on to claim that, quote, there are things in it which in their powerful thought exceed anything I have ever beheld in painting, end quote. Now, I'm guessing most of you aren't having quite that experience right now, but I want you to think about what it was that made Dickens feel that powerfully. Dickens's observation reveals the extent of the felt reciprocity between the intellectual endeavor involved in the interpretative act and the experience of moral enlightenment. By constructing perspective such that viewers see themselves as providing the corporeal reality of the theater, you're the moving part of the audience as part of the painting, and by encouraging the audience to participate in that mode of expression through remembered associations with the plight of real women, the distance of aesthetic idealism is compressed into the presence of a face who, as Levinas might say, whose destitution, as Levinas might say, cries out for justice. To put it another way, the moment of appreciation for the technical artistry of perspective is illuminated by the figure of Ophelia, who is irrevocably tied to the ethical context of the viewing public and their correlative moral sense. The canvas collapses theatrical experience into ethical awareness, so that to see, to aesthetically experience, is inevitably to see the other moral sensibility. By the time Edwin Austin Abbey picked up his brush, the possibilities for visual phronesis, that's what you call that, advanced by Mcleese and modified by Rossetti, had been given additional cultural impetus by the full consummation of the relationship between theatrical painting and pictorial theater in the late 1890s. Indeed, a brief glance at the decades of Abbey's success demonstrates the extent to which the theoretical possibilities advanced by these several artists had come to cultural fruition. For even more so than any prior work, Abbey's The Play Scene in Hamlet heightens the function of the text's thick citational context, transposing the behavioral practices dramatized by the Shakespeare script text with the re-signification of social practices constituting contemporary life, a means of approaching theatricality as inherently ethical, purposeful, meant to address culture's needs. Indeed, by the late 1800s, the transposition of visual parts for verbal passages was a typical mode of Victorian stage performances of Shakespeare. According to Bram Stoker, Abbey's friend Henry Irving, the producer-actor who was internationally renowned for his spectacular Shakespeare productions, was adamant that the visuals supersede the written text, an improvement upon what he and others considered to be the more rustic vision of 16th and 17th century theater. When discussing his attention to detail in staging, Irving claimed that, quote, "We build up the whole play scene by scene in order to produce a perfect work of art. Each scene is like his picture to a painter. You have to combine colors, groups, figures, and arrange the mountings," end quote. For this reason, when planning a production of Richard II, Irving turned to Abbey, among others, for help with costume and set design, advice on lighting and color effects, and general aid in other aesthetic details. Abbey and the other artists with whom Irving worked had considerable success in achieving precisely this painterly effect. Eventually, Abbey was to become an experienced set and costume designer, merging the theatricality of his chalks, pastels, and oils with the fabrics, props, and rehearsals of staging practice. Like Mcleese's depiction, Abbey's painting also emphasizes surveillance, but reverses the perspective. Reading and comprehending once again become the moment of pictorial theatricality, but Abbey diverges from his predecessors by placing special emphasis on the mime show. Significantly, it is a moment in the play where the pictorial precedes the verbal, and where scripted words must bow to the act of ethically inflected performance. As with Mcleese, the function of Abbey's painting is to remove speech from the center of theatrical expression, while granting it, nevertheless, a performative role in memory. However, whereas Mcleese invokes the centrality of action to drama through the manipulation of shadowy figures, Abbey accomplishes the same, far more forcefully, by positioning you, the viewer, as the dumb show upon which Hamlet and the court are gazing. In this way, Abbey matches the performativity of his own artistic endeavor as illustrator with that of Shakespeare as playwright, an alignment that usefully invokes the playwright's cultural status as a moral touchstone. In fact, the moment also encapsulates Abbey's own philosophy as an illustrator and painter. For the mime show, after all, is drama without speech, communication without immediate reference to words, and its dramatic force is driven by the thematic emphasis on the function of the gaze. To put it another way, the viewer of a mime show shares aesthetic ground with the viewer of a painting, for a painting is dumb. The audience drives the drama, providing any reference to speech or action from memory and imagination. Given that Abbey could rely on his Victorian audience to appreciate what it meant to be a viewer framed within a theater self-consciously creating itself as painting, little effort was required to coach such an audience into its own role within a broader visual frame, to see itself, in other words, as part of a larger image within which performance takes place. For Abbey's audience, the habit of viewing theatrical performances in which all movement became a static image, halting, compressing time so that the full implications of events and relations could be savored. You know, I have to pause and just stress this. This is an amazing thing. In the period, in the pictorial theater, you'd be watching Hamlet, and then suddenly the actors would all stop and hold still for a minute or two. And during that time where they held the tableau, you were meant to contemplate the deeper meanings of that particular moment in the play. And we know from contemporary diaries and letters that apparently it was a very powerful thing to do because audience members would sometimes break down sobbing as they contemplated a particular scene. So let me go on. If anything, the moment where the audience recognizes itself as the players upon which the characters of the painting gaze is the moment where the period's fascination with the intense relationship between technical skill and the act of ethical knowing is most fully realized. Even more so than Mcleese, Abbey's manipulation of perspective is a means of making the play space encompass more than the canvas, while emphasizing the artificiality of the dramatic moment. By making the viewing audience the dumb show, Abbey has made the stance of viewer, your stance, perform the role of audience, to gaze, and actor, to play, thus making his illustrated performance theatrical. I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time and simply point out that ultimately, just as the figure of Ophelia is both a frame for Hamlet and the locus of visual relief, Abbey manages to place his audience on the margin and at the center of the drama. In Abbey's Hamlet, the most interior moment of the play, the dumb show, nevertheless gestures toward what we have typically assumed to be the most exterior place of performance, the position of the viewer. By distilling this technical aspect of the painting into the matrix of cultural illusion that the figure of Ophelia posits, the work elides the distinction between the appreciation of aesthetic technique and the contemplative aspect of ethical experience. It's for this reason that Dickens and others believed that this performance of Shakespeare simply could not be topped. Shakespeare became the medium for expressing the brilliance of contemporary artists and thinkers. He could be used to lend aid to their wisdom. By the end of the 19th century, pictorial theater and visual phronesis would give way to moving pictures, and Shakespearean cinema would begin its debut with the 1899 silent film King John. Live orchestral music accompanied such screenings, giving a special new emphasis to the relationship between viewing action and hearing concepts. Furthermore, the action was bolstered by the rhythms of music rather than the spoken word, and subtitles at the bottom of the scene created a peculiar new link between reading print and watching a performance. And suddenly, I will conclude. And to conclude, I return to Yeats. Part of what would come to be known as the modernist movement, this author is still sitting in the Hotel Utah, commentating on his visit to the BYU Academy. I should note, in the letter that he's writing to Olivia Shakespeare, he describes the BYU Academy as in a little Grecian town and how charming it is, etc. The American West at this time was still very much a frontier and would be considered so well into the 1930s. Attending at least one performance during this period, Yeats experienced a peculiar version of Shakespeare, best characterized, perhaps, as a literary theatrical avatar of the American ideal of e pluribus unum. Indeed, even a cursory review of the diversity of the frontier legacy suggests as much, and I want you to contrast what I'm about to say with everything I've said before. Consider, for instance, the variety of purpose and resources that might be entailed in the theater of the gold rush miners versus that of the Great Plains homesteaders, or in the dramatic endeavors of encamped U.S. cavalry versus the somber recitations of itinerant elocution coaches, or in the productions of small groups of Northwest trappers versus the theologically inflected performances of Mormon pioneers settling in the Utah territories with an eye toward building a New Jerusalem. What these various community theater subcultures reveal, especially when set off in contrast to the professional theater and the high culture artistic movements already outlined here, is Shakespeare's usefulness in keeping the ideals of inspired genius and purposeful betterment in productive equipoise. Thank you.